we think government has been really shaky about their stats. First, they say they want to have in young democracy, but then in the later web, they say that, okay, let's talk about in the mature scenarios democracy, right? We think that they also have not know what the definition of political extremism, when we already told you that the definition is when you are oppositional to the idea of the system that is currently happening. For example, in Indonesia, it will be HTI when they are positional towards, for example, our government, because they want to make a caliphate, a country of only Muslim. This is the kind of things that we oppose, and we don't think that this kind of people should, for example, have the formal political sphere, right? 3 clarifications before I move on to my class, right? So first, definition of evil. We think that evil in this case, we are not, for example, dismissing their grievances. We already know, for example, they might have their own reason, but nevertheless, we don't think that that should, for example, make us for example, include them when their belief is contradictory to our government, that it creates, for example, internal questioning and therefore delegitimizing, right? Because if the hatred is that entrenched on their side of the house, what they would do when they have this formal sphere is that they will start to delegitimizing this government on how, for example, if you disqualify them in any way, they will continue to the rhetoric, right? On how, look, how we are oppressed even when, for example, we have this kind of formal political sphere, or even because our characteristic of they are non-compromising, even when you give the formal sphere, we don't think that it will stop until there, right? But secondly, we are not dismissing this political extremist group, because we think in a democratic country, everyone has a basic right. But to what extent do we give them right is to the only extent of community, right? On how, for example, they have still the freedom of expression, they can still, for example, gather or have a small gathering, but we do not want for them to have, for example, campaign. We do not for them to build a political party and therefore have, for example, strong legal voter, right? But thirdly, when they say that the government will have a stronger bargaining power in turning this, for example, political extremist groups' ways, we think it is false. Because if they want to say that this suddenly, this political groups will use data, we think that no. Because inherently, political extremist groups stroke your, for example, your ideology. Stroke, for example, on how you have to vote for Ahok, because, for example, you cannot vote for Ahok because he's not Islam, for example. Or you have to, for example, build this kingdom of only Islam, discriminating everyone. Means that they are inherently using only ideology that is, for example, not accommodating. So we don't see why they would use data. But secondly, if they want to say disqualify, as I have mentioned before, they would only use this as rhetoric, as continuous expression, as oppression, right? 3 things I'm going to explain in my classes, right? On how the setting that the government use. But secondly, we'll talk about what kind of platform, what differentiates with our proposal, with our only towards the basic of rights, compared to them when we give them formal political sphere. But thirdly, what is the end result of all of this, right? First, let's talk about the setting, right? If they want to argue that this can only happen in young democracy, we think that first, when they acknowledge that young democracy is still learning and you're still determining how you want to go, extremism is not the party you would want to include in the first place, right? Because extremists with the 2 characteristics, that first, they are non-compromising, but second, they also are opposing to government value. They, for example, want to have only Islam, not, for example, accommodate to other religions. That has not been rebutted, so we think that this characteristic stands. Means that you, as a vulnerable state, cannot allow a party that is oppressive and exclusionary to a certain minority, right? Because on their side of the house, you're going to invite a certain uncertainty variable to your government when you have a certain party that continues to say that, for example, on our value is right and others are wrong, right? But secondly, when they told you, for example, that the only reason we need to give this platform to them is that political extremists right now has no platform, right? They have never explained to you why in the status quo is that the case, right? Because if you talk about India with feminism, currently there are parties, for example, like Gerindra, like Indonesia, who advocates for RUU PKS, right? Or how, for example, in OPM, they are that advocates for better treatment for the Papua. They are also a political party. Because why? Because they also gain momentum, right? And there are also, for example, important issues that we start to take notice on. But this is important because it means that their grievances can be addressed without this formal political sphere anyway, which defeats, for example, their issue or the reason why we should do this policy at the very first place, right? But secondly, let's talk about what kind of platform and what is the differentiation, right? we as the opposition side of the house told you that what's important is that we give them a community, right? You are allowed, for example, to have small gathering. You are allowed to some certain extent advertise yourself. And for example, if you are really that determined, you can also have alliance with the major political party, like what we did, for example, what FPI did with Gerindra, for example. But what is specifically different with formal political platform, right? We think that first, formal political platform give you legitimacy. Legitimacy is derived from repetition and exposure, right? Because the moment you continue expose that this is the thing that is true, people start believing in it. The moment you are allowing them to campaign is the moment you allow, for example, TV exposure for them, right? Poster everywhere or campaigns that is vulnerable to, for example, the lower power society. But secondly, if you allow them for the election, means that candidate have an official platform to also, for example, spread their ideas, right? This is why we question their, for example, idea coming from the second speaker when they say that if, for example, there's a separatism idea, then we can also neutralize it with the discussion that existing, which we question how the discussion will go, right? Because we think that what in their side of the house, what they continue to do is to only amplify the separatism value and why we have to do it. What kind of discussion is happening, we don't know. But considering this, people are easily taken in by rhetorics or jargons, especially by political extremists who use, for example, religion to advocate for their, for example, purpose, right? Therefore, we don't think any discussion should be, for example, necessary to the point of formal political spectrum, when currently, for example, like social media also provide that kind of educational benefit, right? So we think that in our side of the house, it's better because we also, for example, acknowledge their rights. We do not amplify the kind of harms that they want. But thirdly, what kind of end result would they have in their side of the house, right? In best case scenario, if they want to talk about separatism like OPM, right? It's very weird scenario because you will only give formal political sphere to only give them a platform to get away, for example, from Indonesia, right? Because their goal is to only separate from Indonesia. If their characteristic of political extremists is to, for example, hating Indonesian government that much, what's stopping them then to use this platform to, for example, gather followers and, for example, revolt against you then, right? This is the dangerous thing. As my first speaker have already told you, in democracy, we acknowledge all rights, but what's important is the stability, right? To the point we also take into consideration of health when we choose a candidate, or we take in consideration whether they believe in Pancasila, so they are aligned with our value, and therefore no revolution will happen. This is very important as a democratic government because sustainability is the most important thing. What they are doing is first is useless because in the current status quo we already provide basic human rights. We already told you why their grievances will be addressed. But secondly, they will only create instability because the way political extremist group, when they get the platform, is to continue to delegitimize everything, like to the point of how, for example, government is not doing enough, or for example, this is now the momentum for us to do more, for example. So even if they want to say we can have mechanism like disqualifying them, it doesn't necessarily say that the kind of influence that have been given to the society will be diminished, right? Because they already have the exposure and people will more likely to get curious and, for example, search for this kind of political extremist group, right? So what do we say as opposition? Within that, first, their setting is weird, their solution is weird, their urgency is not. But secondly, they also fail to differentiate what kind of differences of the impact that this formal political sphere have. And therefore, we're proud to oppose. Thank you.